You're listening to the Wrigleyville Nation podcast. Season ticket holders and lifelong fans with neighborhood ties discuss Cubs news and neighborhood happenings. Here's your hosts, Jeremy and Pat.
Hello and welcome to the Wrigleyville Nation podcast. This is episode 311 of the podcast. My name is Jeremy Deemer and I'll be your host. And I'm joined as always by my co-host. He's my cousin and he's high atop Wrigleyville tonight. How's it going, Pat?
Going well, Jeremy. How are you?
Couldn't be better. It was a great weather weekend here in Chicago. Got to go outside. Was very thrilled about that. Got to go to a Cubs game on Friday. Enjoyed that immensely. We've got a lot to talk about. When it comes to those Cubs, we'll talk briefly and unpack the disastrous road trip. We will talk about this series at home against the Marlins. And, of course, all of the roster moving and shaking, Cubs debuts, a lot to get to. And to help us unpack all the news of the week and talk all things Cubs, you know her from all of her fantastic baseball writings and her great podcast, and friend of this show, Sara Sanchez. Welcome back. Thank you for coming on to talk Cubs with us tonight.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me.
And let's start with, before we get to this weekend's series, let's recap. Since last we podcasted, Pat, the Cubs were in Washington, and
it started off so promisingly too, right?
Yeah, they win that first game and then proceed to lose 3 straight one-run losses. The team could not hit with runners in scoring position, but let's start there. We had high hopes for this road trip. When we looked at the schedule, we said, at Washington and then Miami. This is the time to build up some wins before the schedule gets really tough. But boy, a 500 team is going to be a 500 team here apparently and play to the level of their competition.
I mean, the Nationals had 10 wins coming into May, and we gave them 3 more. The first in second, third, and fourth, and it was against a hodgepodge of pitchers too. Trevor Williams, former Cub, of course, AAA starter, and then Patrick Corbin, who struggled mightily the last several years. So it's not as if the Cubs are going up against a gauntlet of playoff level pitching, and yet the Cubs scored 1 run, and 3 runs in those 3 games, which is too bad because our pitching, on the other hand, seemed to hold Washington down. Not that should be too hard since Washington's not a great offensive juggernaut, but still, you got to come away, you would think, with more than 1 win out of those 4 games. Just the way things stack up, we're gonna have to do some pretty impressive stuff against some better teams now to make up for it, I guess.
Yeah, Sarah, it was pretty disappointing series coming off of the sweep in Miami to then see this road trip continue to just be a disaster offensively.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not trying to be a downer, but I think that this team is currently constructed as like a 78-ish win team. They're going to get up to 500 if everything goes right. And I mean, again, I'm not trying to be a downer, but like a lot has gone right for the Cubs so far. Nico Horner has been excellent. He is one of the league leaders in steals. Patrick Wisdom has been great. He is one of the league leaders in home runs. And with all of that, and with the pitching that they have gotten, they dropped 6 out of 7 to the Marlins and the Nationals. So I just think that, there's going to be moments of great baseball here, and there's going to be moments where the team looks like they're struggling a bit. And in particular, at this moment in time, it sort of seems like not having a go-to formula in the bullpen for the back end of games has really come back to haunt this team, which is part of why they're losing 1-run games and losing games late. And, those are frustrating games to lose, but we'll see what happens if they can get some stability in the back end of the bullpen.
Yeah, I was really nervous with Keegan Thompson's outings in Washington here. It was great to see him bounce back on Saturday and have the game that we needed to see from him on Saturday, pitching against Miami. 3 innings, only 1 hit, 2 strikeouts. Good bounce back, because I was getting nervous that Keegan Thompson was going to be struggling here, and this bullpen can't handle that.
especially after I put the curse on him last week by talking about how he had righted himself, and we were premature in our meaning Cubs Twitter desire to have him start the year at AAA. Remember when his velocity was down in spring training, and then I get a good chuckle last week about how that was all bygones and he's fine. And then of course he turns around and says, "Not so fast." But yeah, you're right. Today's game was a nice change for him, given what we've done. I guess to me, to Sarah's point, the problem that the Cubs are going to have is if they don't have, other than say, for example, Patrick Wisdom, they don't have a lot of power hitting. They're going to have games like today where they go into extra innings, they play 5 extra innings. It's like, would somebody please hit a home run at some point? Just, like, when was the last time the Cubs had a home run this year where it's like, oh, wow, that won the game. Great. Now we're done. It's a team that puts a lot of hits together and scores runs that way and scores runs with some speed, which is pretty fun to see. But when they're not hitting well, average-wise, like they have it the last week, I mean, against those decrepit teams we just mentioned, the Cubs are hit about 245, right? So that's not great. And the power just doesn't make up for it. Like they can't 3-run home run their way out of some of this stuff.
You mentioned it, Sarah. Patrick Wisdom's one of the league leaders in home runs. You can only ride a Patrick Wisdom hot streak so far before you need someone else to start hitting.
Well, I mean, and I think that's why we saw them finally call up Matt Mervis. I think they did it about 4 weeks too late. But it's good to see him here in Chicago. Now, we haven't really seen his power yet, but we will, I'm sure, at Wrigley as he gets going. But yeah, I think that Patrick absolutely nailed it. I mean, there's not a lot of power on this team right now. So you got to string together a few hits and have impeccable base running to get those runs across the board, absent some of those power threats sprinkled throughout your lineup.
You mentioned Matt Mervis. He was called up on Friday for his major league debut. It was a tough matchup for him, but I'm glad that David Ross didn't give him the Chris Bryant debut treatment and bat him fourth. He had him bat him.
I remember that game.
Yeah, yeah. We were
against the Diamondbacks, wasn't it? And he struck out 3 straight times.
Yeah, so we were at that game. I know you were, Sarah, you and I were both separately at Willson Contreras' debut as well, and you were also there. I was there on Friday as well for Matt Mervis' debut. Your thoughts on what a great moment it was. I thought it was a great moment for Matt Mervis getting his first hit and RBI. The tremendous reaction from the crowd. Your thoughts on getting to see the excitement of the entire stadium when he came up to bat for the first time. I thought that was just so much fun.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a hot minute since there's been a hitting prospect called up in the middle of the year that has had that much hype around him. I was actually talking to a friend of mine out in the bleachers, and we kind of felt bad for Miguel Amaya because Miguel Amaya came up for his first at bat at Wrigley Field, like 2 guys after Mervis, and really didn't get the same type of welcome at all. My apologies, Miguel. You deserved way more than you got from the Wrigley faithful. I think they were just a little bit, overwhelmed since it was Mervis's actual major league debut that day, as opposed to Amaya had made his debut a few days earlier in DC. But no, it was a fun environment. I mean, it's always fun when you have young guys out there making their first starts. And one of the things that I've noticed with Mervis so far, and like I said, we haven't seen the power that is the real reason he's here all that much yet, but I think that he's flashed some pretty good leather at first base. He's been more than adequate. Yeah, he's been more than adequate as a defender. He's absolutely saved some plays, making some really good picks, as you said. Turned a real nice double play earlier today on Sunday. So I'm excited for what we see from Mervis there, and I'm very excited that it means fewer at bats for Eric Hosmer.
Very much agree.
Poor Eric Hosmer, almost the hero of the day today, but not.
Yeah, that was it was Hosmer's performance that led to finally Mervis getting the call up. I mean, Hosmer had struggled so poorly offensively and defensively in that Washington series that it was hard for the Cubs to wait another time. You mentioned it's 4 weeks too late. I couldn't agree more. the hand was finally forced by the performance of Hosmer in that series.
When you are below replacement level, you should be replaced by someone. that's sort of my general theory on that.
Yeah, and it was great. Theory. Yeah, it was great to see. You mentioned Miguel Amaya getting his call up as well. There's a guy who you have to root for. A guy like him. He was such a touted prospect for the Cubs, and then had just battled injuries for so long that to finally see him get the call up and he was hitting the ball well before finally getting his first hit, Sarah.
Yeah, he was. So the thing that was really impressive about Amaya, and he didn't have very much to show for it at first, but his first 5, I think, batted ball events were all over 100 miles per hour, which is hitting the ball quite hard. He didn't get a hit out of it. His first hit was like a 67 mile per hour squibber off the mound, because that's how baseball works sometimes. But Miguel Amaya's been doing a great job behind the plate. He seems to be calling a pretty good game. Hayden Wesneski had nothing but good things to say about his performance behind the plate earlier today. And you know, it'll be interesting to see what happens when Jan is off the concussion protocol. I imagine that Amaya gets sent back. He has options. Obviously, got called up straight from AA. He hasn't even been playing in Iowa just yet. So I think that this is just a stopgap measure while Yan Gomes is recovering. But it's been a great stopgap measure. And as you mentioned, we've been waiting to see Miguel Amaya up with the big league club for a few years. I think he was the top prospect in the organization 4 years ago before he dealt with a rash of injuries.
He's one of those guys who I can't decide whether or not I'm surprised that he came up 2 months early or that he's like 2 years behind. It feels like, on the one hand, we had hoped and expected him to come up sooner, but for the rash of injuries that Sarah pointed out. On the other hand, I was kind of surprised that he came up so quickly this year, frankly, because he's barely played at all in the last 2 years, and with COVID before that, he's just lost or not had a lot of at bats, and hasn't really caught much either. And then all of a sudden, he's at the major league level doing both. So that's great. But that's a pleasant surprise. I really wasn't expecting that so soon.
I mean, I think it's a little bit of 40-man roster crunch and the Cubs not wanting to go out and put another catcher on the 40-man. And we saw how reticent they were to move on from Luis Torrens, who they finally did right before Yan Gomes got hurt. So whoops, Luis Torrens, enjoy your time with the Baltimore Orioles. Orioles picked him up off the waiver wires. We'll be sending cash considerations back to Chicago. But, the Cubs at that point had a choice. They had a free 40-man spot, and they clearly wanted to use that for Matt Mervis, who was not on the 40-man at that point in time. If they use that spot for a backup catcher, then they have to cut one of their many bullpen arms and some of their pitching flexibility, most likely, in order to do that. And I think they just really didn't want to do that. So they decided to see what Amaya could do at the big league level. And honestly, he seemed totally fine. So I'm here for it.
Yeah, absolutely. Another person who was beyond fine and was just absolutely fantastic and has been fantastic this whole year was the pitching performance on Friday of Justin Steele. 7 innings. He went 6 hits, 1 run, no walks, 4 strikeouts against Miami. In his 7th start of the season, Steele has lowered his ERA to 1.45 and tied Jake Arrieta's franchise record with 14 consecutive starts allowing 2 earned runs or fewer. This is Justin Steele and right up there with Marcus Stroman in Cubs ace territory here for this pitching staff. It's pretty exciting to see this type of performance, and I do want to get your thoughts on Justin Steele. Then I want to know what you do, Sarah, with Jameson Taillon and Kyle Hendricks coming back. What does this rotation look like? But first, your thoughts on just what a season for Justin Steele so far.
Yeah, Justin Steele has been exceptional, and he's kind of a little bit of a mystery because he doesn't have some of the pitch mix that other pitchers who are performing at this level have. And that's not a knock on Steele. It's just that he uses a fewer number of pitches that he throws very well to create deception in a way that most people need 4 distinct pitches in order to do that. And Steele's not doing that. He is, I mean, at one point yesterday, it looked like he was just using one pitch, and locating it pristinely for an entire inning. And he's like, and the next time through the order, I will show you my second pitch. But it's like, I'm not entirely sure how he's getting away with that, but he is right now. And what he's doing is he's forcing batters into generating a ton of weak contact. So, he's got a decent number of Ks, but he's not out there. He's not like a strikeout darling like a Garrett Cole or something like that. He's really just getting a lot of weak contact from hitters, and the Cubs' exceptional defense is turning that weak contact into outs. And that's the name of the game. You don't have to be a strikeout guy to be a great pitcher. The name of the game is getting outs. And so I really like what we've seen from Justin Steele so far. You mentioned what happens when Jamison Taillon is healthy and when Kyle Hendricks is healthy. I am sort of the mind that we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Drew Smiley has been healthy for a longer period of time than I remember him starting a season healthy. So I'm sure that it's just a matter of time before he needs a trip to the IL for a little bit, or somebody else, right? Like, it's one of those situations where depth in the case of starting pitching usually takes care of itself by somebody needing an IL stint at some point in time. But it's a nice problem to have if you've got 6 guys who can handle starting the game.
Yeah, since his last start of 2021, 31 starts for Justin Steele, and he's got an ERA well under 3 during that stretch, which is pretty impressive. There aren't a whole lot of pitchers who have put up the numbers he has in that period of time. In fact, this is total non sequitur, Jeremy, and I'm just doing this for fun, but he's got more WAR since he came up in 2021 than Christian Yelich in the same period of time. But that's just that's neither here nor there. Anyway, no, he has just fun to say out loud. He has he's really been impressive. He's the kind of pitcher the Cubs really have needed for years, to come up from the minor league system. And you think back to like the 2017 and 18 seasons and 19 seasons, like, boy, if they just had one guy, who could have come up like Justin Steele has these last 3 years and performed like this, what a difference that would make. They wouldn't be chasing their tail either in free agency or through trades, trying to find that missing piece. They would have had it right there. But oh well, they have it now, and I hope, despite, as Sarah pointed out, the pitch mix that he has, which I think maybe accounts for some of the maybe underratedness of his outcomes, which are superior to, I think, what people really look at and think about. From when you on the national level, people are, he's okay, or he's lucky or whatever, but he's really not that lucky. He's just good. His FIP last year was the same as his ERA. It's not like it's not like it's all smoke and mirrors. He's just a good pitcher.
Yeah, absolutely. And the Cubs, we touched on it briefly. They're trying to find a good pitcher for the back end of this bullpen. And
you mean a closer? I think
yes.
That was the term they used to use to describe those people.
We saw Mark Leiter Jr. pick up the save on Friday. We saw Adbert Elzalai pick up the save on Saturday. We've seen Fulmer and Boxberger, and we've seen a lot of folks try this out. Sarah, is the closer for the Cubs on the roster right now, or do they have to go continue the search?
I think they have a closing candidate on the 40-man, but I don't think that I would like to see Adbert get a deep shot at save opportunities going forward. I think that he'll probably be just fine. Most of the concerns around Adbert have to do with facing left-handed hitters. And frankly, I don't think any of us know what happens with Adbert coming out of the pen facing lefties. He hasn't really gotten a chance to do it. And I imagine that the extra velocity and stuff that he has, because he's only throwing 1 inning rather than 4+, probably does just fine against lefties. The guy who I'm sort of intrigued by, who I believe has just started getting some work in, is Cody Hoyer, who is still working his way back from surgery. And I think that is probably the long-term closer in the Cubs' eyes for the future, but he's probably not back in Chicago until at least June.
Yeah, I think the guy who I would really like to see in the Cubs closer role right now is Alex Lang from Detroit, who used to be a Cub uh, until they traded him. Uh, but given the people on the roster right now, Jeremy, we've talked about this, over the months, and I think we're both Alzolay fans. But the Cody Hoyer thing is interesting. The 99 mile an hour on his first pitch, was a nice touch. So I think the Cubs have some options, but for as many one-run games as they play, they do need to figure out somebody who, or maybe a group of two, who can come in that situation and be effective. Because it feels like they're giving away games right now that maybe they shouldn't. And so we'll see how that all plays out. But that was definitely a weakness coming into the season. The Fulmer idea was just kind of the Cubs have been so successful in a lot of those relief pitchers they've gotten off the scrap heap the last couple of years, but they don't all work out. And this is one that may not have. It may have been better to spend a few more bucks and try to get somebody a little bit better, but here we are. So I'd say Alzolay until Cody's ready to come up, which at the rate he's going might be 2 weeks from now, for all we know. Who knows?
Sarah disagrees with this.
He'll be up to 105 by next week, right?
I think he threw his first pitches since surgery yesterday, if I'm correct. So 2 weeks might be a little ambitious.
99 miles an hour.
Maybe give the guy the month of May to build up or something.
Out of the womb, the first thing he threw, the first object he threw from the womb, 99 miles an hour. I feel like that's a good start. What's that movie? Is it the kid? What was it? The Cubs, the kid who pitches for the Cubs.
Rookie of the Year.
Rookie of the Year. There you go. Yeah.
Yeah. So we'll see how that plays out. I like Alzolay as he was also my preseason prediction, Pat, to lead the team in saves.
Yeah.
So
I don't remember mine, so that's kind of good, probably.
All right. One last thing before we get to the week ahead and preview the upcoming series against St. Louis, let's take a moment to talk about the last placed St. Louis Cardinals. Going into this weekend, they're 20th in starters ERA and FIP, and that's with Jordan Montgomery saving their ass every fifth day with a sub-4 ERA and a sub-3 FIP.
Their pitching sucks.
Their pitching is terrible.
I'm sorry, but and it wasn't great last year either. Like, this isn't a new phenomenon necessarily.
No, Michaelis lost a little off his previously unimpressive fastball. Matz has lost a full mile per hour off his primary pitch, the sinker, and Flaherty's healthy, but also has a healthy 15% walk rate currently. So they're hoping for Father Time, Adam Wainwright, to come and save the day for this team. Somehow, with this terrible pitching lineup, the Cardinals are blaming these struggles on Willson Contreras. This is insane, Sarah. I can't believe this. I
mean, I believe it because I watched Cubs fans do it to Willson for 3 years. So I'm honestly fairly certain they got the idea from Cubs fans, and all the Cubs fans out there posting, look at what Wilson's pitcher ERA is, which, by the way, not a real stat. Everybody who's when Willson catches, the ERA is X, and when Yan Gomes catches, the ERA is Y. This is not a predictive anything. These are very small sample sizes, and catcher-pitcher ERA is not a thing.
So when Sandy Martinez caught Kerry Wood's 20 strikeout game for the first time he'd ever caught him, ever, how many times I've heard about, a catcher has to catch a pitcher 150 times before it works. I'm like, not always.
Now, I will say, I think that for whatever reason, and I don't pretend to know what's going on behind the scenes in St. Louis, they have dug themselves a bunch of media messaging disasters this year. They had the Tyler O'Neill issue earlier this season where Tyler O'Neill got basically called out because his approach at the plate was different than other Cardinals hitters. And They functionally benched him for a while, which was ridiculous. He's supposed to be their starting center fielder, and everybody was just like, well, are you going to use him? Because if you're not going to use him, you should probably trade him for better pitching because your pitching is terrible. Now they have done the whole, they called up a third catcher without it. And it kind of sounds like they didn't tell Contreras they were calling up a third catcher, that Willson found this out when he got to the clubhouse, which how do you let that happen? You should probably have a conversation with the guy before the third catcher is in St. Louis. But I feel terrible for Willson with all of this. I think that he works really hard by all accounts, and he has been given a not very good rotation that was probably overperforming a little bit because of the way Yadi worked with them for going on 2 decades. I don't know, man. That just seems like a really rough situation to be the catcher for. And it also seems like it's nobody thought you were hiring the best pitcher, defensive catcher in the pool. That's never been Wilson's thing. He's a bat first catcher. Everybody knew that going in. There's lots of early Cardinals interviews where they talked about that. So yeah, the whole thing just looks like a mess to me. I am going to be at Wrigley Field on Monday night cheering for Willson Contreras like I always do.
Good.
And
yes.
I honestly just feel bad that St. Louis has put him in this position, and I hope he rises to the occasion. By the way, I was reading over at Viva Alberto's, which is the SB Nation Cardinal site, because they're usually relatively logical over there, and I wanted to see what real Cardinals fans were saying about all of this, and they're frustrated with their front office. They're not frustrated with Contreras. They're like, Willson Contreras can't make this rotation good. The front office has basically done a terrible job with messaging here, and I think that's how I would feel if I were a Cardinals fan. But yeah, it's a mess over there in St. Louis, and they are riding it straight to last place. I think it's the worst start they've had in 50 years or something like that.
Yeah, they're in dead last place. For whatever reason, Contreras has been chosen as a scapegoat by the organization, which I think is unfair. Nolan Arenado, on the other hand, is hitting like Darwin Barney right now. He's got an OPS of about 600. So I haven't heard a word about that, right? That's supposed to be one of your stud players who you're paying, who should be getting $35 million a year. Who knows how much they're probably paying $1.50, and the rest is still being paid by Colorado. But anyway, Contreras, if you dig into it, if you go by OPS plus, he is 300% better than Yadier Molina was last year. Just saying, as a hitter, which is sort of what you kind of got him for, right? I mean, he's having a perfectly fine, solid offensive season. If you look at his defensive WAR, it's in the positive. It's not in the negative. So then you get down to this amorphous, pitch calling, all the pitchers are terrible, so it must be his fault. And then so they bring in another catcher, and in the first 2 games out, they give up 6 or 7 runs a game, just like they do every game. So, is that his fault too? I saw on Cardinals Twitter, there were at least a few people today saying, wow, Contreras called for that fastball right down the middle of the plate from the bench, that led to the grand slam by the Tigers today. He's terrible, mocking that notion that somehow he's to blame for all of that. Yeah, it is unfortunate. I guess the other part that's unfortunate for me is that I also have to live in Chicago, and for whatever reason, there's been this odd sort of fixation by many on, and it's probably just Cubs Twitter more than fans in general, but this really negative Willson Contreras leaving the Cubs thing, and I find it peculiar on a number of fronts, but primarily because Willson Contreras wanted to be a Cub forever. Let's not forget, he came through the organization. Jim Henry was the one who signed him. He wanted to stay. The Cubs offered him 1 contract extension in 2018. I think it was 6 years and $24 million, total lowball deal. He's made 4 times that much in guaranteed money, right? So after that, in 2019 and 2020 and 21 and 22, Cubs offered him no extensions. He's like, please, I'll stay. They're like, nope, we don't want you. In fact, we so don't want you, we're going to trade you at the trade deadline. So we had that whole maudlin week of teary-eyed goodbyes in July. And then they screwed up the trade, right? And they ended up not trading him, which is super awkward because then, we got the whole rest of the season and we had some more goodbyes in September. And then, at the end of the year, he leaves basically for virtually nothing. I love the pushback of, well, they got a compensatory pick after the 3rd round in the draft, which is worth 55 cents on the open market, really, in the grand scheme of things for an all-star catcher, right? So he leaves. He signs with the Cardinals for 5 years and $87 million. Good for him. And as part of that, he talked about how great the organization was and how he liked Molina and all these other things that offended some Cubs fans because they thought that. I mean, look, was he trolling them a little bit? Yeah, probably. Is he the most mature baseball player in the history of the game? No, certainly not. But then again, he played his whole career with a team that basically told him to pound sand. They didn't want him.
Right.
And I don't know too many people who, if your employer said, you know what, Jeremy, you suck. We don't want you here. And somebody else signed you for like 10 times what you were making. I think it'd be a little bit of like, on your part, you might be a little finger wagging back, right? Like that's a normal reaction. So whatever. So, we've seen at least, the Cubs Twitterverse has been following very intently his every at bat this year, like they're ESPN watching Barry Bonds chase the home run record or something, just to kind of justify in their own minds that Jed was right and the Cubs never should have re-signed him. And so it's almost like there's been this kind of rooting against him personally, which I find peculiar because I root against the Cardinals, root against him when you're playing him if you want to. That's fine. But why single him out as somebody to root against and be the object of derision for the whole season? I think it's, speaking of maturity, I think that's not a super mature way to approach it either. So I'm sure when the Cubs play the Cardinals on Monday, most of the fans at the stadium will be cheering. There might be a smattering of boos and maybe a super majority of Twitter Cubs people will put on their battle armor and go to the keyboard and write nasty things about Contreras. But I think overall, hopefully after this series, we can get past this whole thing and at least as Cubs fans, try not to necessarily gloat in his demise to the extent that there is a demise, which I still think is a false construct from Cardinals upper management. But it's just been it's been a long time since I've seen a Cubs player who wanted to stay forced to leave because the team would not have him, and then the fans turn on him so quickly. I can't really explain the phenomenon, but here we are.
Not this podcast, not these fans here. We love Willson Contreras. He's the kind of person you should be rooting for. And no matter who he plays for, you should be rooting for him as a person because he's a tremendous leader, a great baseball player, and super fun to watch. And yeah, I hope he gets the ovation he deserves as when he returns to Chicago.
We talked ad nauseum about this before too. It's not so much that like we insisted the Cubs re-sign Willson Contreras for 5 years and $87 million or anything. It was get something for him in return at the trade deadline if you aren't going to re-sign him, and B, then you have a responsibility to replace him with someone good, right? That's the deal. And they got Tucker Barnhart, who, by the way, as long as they're making fun of Contreras, Tucker Barnhart's been pretty miserable so far. And at DH, we've got, Mancini, basically. I mean, so we're spending, just for 1 year, not for 5, I get it. But we're spending more money this year on those two guys than Contreras is making this year with St. Louis, for what it's worth. But, yeah, we just want the team to be good. And if you don't want to commit 5 years to a 31-year-old catcher who's more of an offense first catcher, I get it. That's fine. But that's not the point necessarily, right? The point is, you still have to improve your team. And certainly at the catching position, it's been a real rough spot for the Cubs. We'll have Tucker Barnhart will be here next year. So we'll see how that goes, even though Amaya might be ready, but we'll see.
Yeah, friend of the show, Sam Fells, in his Deadspin article said it best when he said, Contreras' framing numbers are perfectly neutral so far this season, which means it's on the pitchers to actually get the baseball in the same zip code as the plate. And the Cardinals have had issues scoring runs, ranking 20th in that category. So not Wilson's fault.
One of the things that has been super fun over on Cubs Twitter, and I'm actually very glad I'll be at the game rather than on Twitter during this, because I actually think that the reaction Cubs fans will have at Wrigley will be great. I think that the reaction Cubs fans will have online will be terrible. But my personal favorite was somebody trying to blame like the Cardinals starters woes on Willson Contreras at some point. And I pulled up framing metrics as like, he's doing a better job than all these other people. And like, it's not great. It was like 67th percentile or something. It's like, he's fine. And the response I got immediately was, it's not framing, it's targeting. And I'm like, it's not even a real stat. You're just like making up new ways to discuss catching that are not measurable or objective, because the ones that we have that we can measure show it's not Willson's fault, and you've decided that it's some other thing. It's game calling, it's targeting, it's the amount of hours he doesn't spend doing something that we're fairly certain Yachty used to do. It's like all of these things are not, like, if you have metrics on them and you have something objective we can all look at, that's one thing. But if you're just like making up new stats because the real stats don't agree with you, I think this is a you problem, not a Willson problem.
So it's not defensive war. It's not pitch framing. It's the sort of like nefarious, game calling, which is, whatever.
It's the unmeasurable stat, the stats you cannot measure by design. Those are the ones he's bad at. Thank you. That's helpful.
Yes, and remind these same people that Yadi Molina caught 71 games last year for the Cardinals.
Right.
We had a basketball team in Puerto Rico.
Exactly. In between dealing with that. So we've got a look ahead to the week that will be for the Cubs. 3 games at home, all night games against St. Louis, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. The first off day in a while on Thursday, and then off to Minnesota for the start of a road trip. 3 in Minnesota, 3 in Houston, 3 in Philadelphia before coming back home for the last week and a half of May. So looking ahead to this Cardinal series, it's hard to make predictions. We see Stroman and Michaelis will be the Monday game. You've got Flaherty and Tyone on Tuesday, and Wednesday will be Montgomery and Steele. So with those pitching matchups, and then looking ahead to playing at Minnesota, how did we do on our predictions last week, Pat, for the week?
Our predictions were fine. The players failed to execute. What can I tell you?
There, okay.
Okay, was it a little bullish to say what were we, 5-2?
We were looking at 5-2. We were very feeling 5-2.
Yeah, I think 3-4 was the outcome. Although today could have gone either way, and as could others. So that's the way it goes. But here we are now, Jeremy. The Cubs have played 13 consecutive games, including an extra 5 innings today. They burned like 6 relief pitchers, which is awful. So these next 3 games, we could use some longer starts. And Stroman and Steele, sure, but I don't know if Tan's going to be able to, straight off the IL, if he's going to be prepared to go 6 innings plus. I think that's a tall order. Also, the Cardinals are terrible. But, of course, just today, like Goldschmidt hits 3 home runs and they score a bunch of runs and they're getting hot. And, Arenado is probably just saving up all his hits just for this series after hitting 4 hits all year.
Sure.
So I worry a little bit about that regression to the mean thing. But that aside, I would very much like for the Cubs to win at least 2 out of 3 in this series. I mean, with Contreras no longer catching, that's a huge advantage for St. Louis. So I'll give him 1 game. But
yeah.
But no, I think I put my money on the Cubs. Well, I won't put my money on it actually, but I'll stake something less valuable. I'll stake my reputation on the idea that the Cubs will win at least 2 out of these 3.
2 out of these 3, and then
yeah,
and then all right, and then going on the road in Minnesota. What do you think?
That's one of those tricky series where you look at the Twins. I always look at the Twins and I think, this is a very beatable team, and somehow they end up outperforming my expectations quite a bit. I think if the Cubs can go 3-3 this week, I'll consider that kind of treading water. They're in a tough stretch, starting with Minnesota, playing teams over 500 for a month for the most part. So if the Cubs could go 3-3, I mean, to Sarah's earlier point, the frustrating part is the Cubs aren't really built to win a lot of games. They're built to win half their games at best. So I see this as a week when they win half their games.
Sarah, what do you think? Predictions for the week. How are they going to do against St. Louis and then on the road?
I mean, I think it's always hard to predict what's going to happen in one of the it's always hard to predict what's going to happen in a series against St. Louis. They've got that rivalry energy between the two teams is just one of those wonderful parts of the game. And it frankly leads to a lot of weird outcomes. It means that when the Cubs are like the worst team in the world, the Cardinals sometimes lose 2 out of 3 to the Cubs, and vice versa. When the Cardinals are struggling, the Cubs can lose 2 out of 3 to them. So really just looking forward to seeing the first iteration of Cubs Cardinals baseball this week. I actually think that it'll be interesting to see what they do when they're on the road against Minnesota later in the week. That's a pretty good Twins team that has been doing a good job in the division out there. And so, yeah, it'll be interesting to see. I'll give them a 500 record.
3-3 as well. Yeah, all those points are solid. I do think that I worry this team is just they struggle. They will start to struggle on the road after that road trip. I worry that this is not going to be a good series in Minnesota. That could easily be maybe they can get one out of there, and then maybe one against St. Louis here. St. Louis is bad, but I'm always worried that this is when they right the ship. I think I think there's two wins this week. I think this is a 2-4 week, but definitely could see 3-3 as well. And rooting, of course, for most of those victories to come against St. Louis. As with the new schedule, these games against St. Louis are precious, and there's only a few. There's only a couple of homestands here. There's one trip to St. Louis, and then the 3 games in London this season. So it's not a lot of games and opportunities against the Cardinals. So you have to see the Cubs take advantage of those when they can here, Pat.
So from opening day to July 19th, the Cubs play the Cardinals 3 times? 2 times. They only play twice in London, I think, right? So 5 total. 5 games total between now and July 19th. That's pretty – that seems light. And then after July 19th, they play them 8 times in 10 days. And then that's it. Is that weird? Like, I know with the new schedule – we talk about playing a lot more American League teams, but it is odd that the Cubs would play them 5 times in the first 3.5 months and then 8 times in 10 days and then not again after July 30th. The Cubs don't play the Cardinals the rest of the season.
Yeah, no, they play them for half of July, and then that's it. so
you remember the old players play other Central Division teams in September kind of, schedule from the past. Yeah, that'll be – well, not that pennant races matter as much because everybody makes the playoffs, it seems like. But still, to not play the Cardinals in August or September seems like a long – it just feels weird to me. I don't know.
Yeah, especially when the Cardinals are so far back right now that they may be clawing back and in that third place range with the Cubs at that point in time, potentially, if not depending on how fast the Pittsburgh team falls back to where we expect them to fall back to.
Meanwhile, the Cubs will play.
They no longer get to play Colorado and Cincinnati all the time. They actually have to play the Dodgers and the Padres and other teams as well. So,
and then in September, the Cubs play 13 games against Arizona and Colorado. That's their September pennant run there. 13 games against those guys. So that's the schedule seems very clumped this year, right? Like, you play a team and then like Miami, right? You play a team and then you play them the next week and you never play them again. There are several examples of that this season where you play a team, you have a series somewhere else, you play them again, and you're done. That's true with Arizona, true with Colorado, true with Miami, all but true with the Cardinals. So let me ask you this though: what odds would you place on the idea that Contreras might defect during the series?
I don't know, man. I'm not sure that Chicago's as welcoming of a place as he left it. I would love him to defect, but I doubt that's going to happen. To go back to the schedule thing really fast, I think that's a function. It's 2 things. One, it's the more balanced schedule this year. They're trying to get every team playing every other team. But in doing so, I think they tried to keep things as close together as possible for rescheduling reasons. And I don't know that creates the most entertaining product.
Yeah.
Right. Like we played the Dodgers 14 times in a row, right? And then we don't play them the rest of the year. It just, it's kind of odd how that worked out.
Sarah, last question from me, and then we'll start to wrap it up here. I wanted your thoughts. I was at the game on Friday, and I got a close-up look at these Miami Marlins jerseys that they had on here. And is it just me, or were you also bothered by that giant ADT patch on? Is it? I found it to be hideous and distracting on these Marlins jerseys.
It's not just you. I find the patches horrifying.
Okay.
I actually also find I think that was the game where they were wearing the black jerseys with the like teal outline or whatever.
Yeah.
That's impossible to read. Like I have pretty decent eyesight. Like that is not a legible jersey at all from any distance whatsoever. So yeah, those jerseys are going to be a no for me, both for the patches and for just like basic legibility.
Pat, any last questions for Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, since we've talked a lot about players who've come up recently, like Mervis and Amaya. What is your thought on Christopher Morel? What should the Cubs be doing with him, and what would you like to see happen with him?
Oh wow, that's a loaded question. I love Christopher Morel, and I think he's got a lot of potential. He's got loud tools. The barrel rate is great. The hard contact is real. He throws the ball hard. He runs fast. He also still strikes out about 28% of the time. And a 28% strikeout rate in AAA probably translates to about a 34% strikeout rate in the majors. I think they probably want him to get that a little bit more under control. That said, he really does give them that sort of power speed combo that they could deploy in the outfield or in the infield. He can spell pretty much anybody on the team for a day of rest. He can be a late inning replacement. So I think Christopher Morel will be up at some point this season. I think they'd probably like him to demonstrate a 25% K rate for a bit before they call him up. But I would look to see him probably replacing the Madrigal role sometime after they've convinced some other team that Nick Madrigal should be traded for.
Oh, you mean the Ohtani trade?
For now, I don't think we're getting Ohtani for Nick Madrigal, but
no.
No. But I mean, ideally, Christopher Morel is getting the at bats that are currently going to Nick Madrigal, in my opinion. And Nick Madrigal is not losing those at bats until the Cubs have turned him into something else that is in their farm system or a value to the team. So I think that's sort of the timeline there. Unless Morel forces their hand by, striking out like 20% of the time for the month of May or something. And if he keeps doing what he's doing with the 20% strikeout rate, it's going to be really hard to keep him in Iowa.
And also, I think if Patrick Wisdom goes into one of his prolonged 3-week slumps, you'll start to see, because really, without him playing well and hitting home runs in this offense, I mean, he is by far the slugging leader on this team. There isn't a lot of power on this team. He and Bellinger really have kind of carried the load on that front. If he goes into one of those slumps that he has been known to do in the past, I think you'll hear more calls for Morel, and there'll be probably more playing time opportunities for somebody else at that position. Let's just see if it's Nick Madrigal or if it's Morel, since you seem so pessimistic about the Ohtani for Madrigal trade, which I thought was a great idea, but fine. I know I can see why you want Madrigal. I know he's a pure hitter and all, but
I'm just not sure the Angels are that bad at their jobs.
Oh, they're pretty bad, but you're right. I think that would probably be a push too far.
And with that, time flies. When we're having fun, we're talking baseball with Sarah. Always a great time. We always appreciate it when you come on. Please remind our listeners where they can find all of your work on the internet and how they can follow you on Twitter as well.
Yeah, I'm at BCB_Sarah, no H on the Sarah on Twitter. You can find my Cubs writing at bleedcubbyblue.com. I am also the co-host of the Cup of Cubby Blue podcast, which is part of the Bleacher Bunch Network, part of Fans First Sports Network. Right now, if you're a fantasy baseball type, I have a fantasy baseball show there called What the Fab that comes out at the start of each week. And then I am also doing a little bit of fantasy baseball writing for Baseball HQ these days.
Excellent stuff as always. And we are out of time. You can follow us on Twitter as well at Wrigleyville Nat. Same for Instagram, facebook.com/WrigleyvilleNation. And you can support the show via Patreon, patreon.com/Wrigleyville Nation. It's how we've been ad-free on this podcast for 5 straight seasons because of all the patrons that continue to support the show. Every single penny, of course, goes right back into the show. We appreciate all of our Patreon supporters. If you can't support the show financially in these times, we understand as well. Telling a Cubs fan friend about the show is another way to support the show. Also, leaving us 5-star reviews. We got a couple last week when we put out the call for some more reviews, so always appreciate those. So keep those coming as all alternative ways to continue to support the show and the things we do here. And all the links I described, all the back catalog of this podcast, everything is available at the website wrigleyvillenation.com. And with that, we're calling it a podcast. Pat, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Thanks again, everyone, for listening, and we'll talk to you again next time.